walk assignments. So we'll take a look at that, maybe like do a little bit of just sort of like a few things I usually do to sort of modify and refine an animation. I'll show you a little bit sort of like continuation of the sort of ZBrush terrain, how to make trees, how to use ZBrush to make slightly nicer trees if you need to, and then how to use Mesh to sort of populate those on the ground. And then pretty much everything else is going to be mostly Open Lab. So there is one assignment that is due next week, and that is the work in progress animation. So specifically animation, not like the generic work in progress you guys have been doing. And I may or may not change the not eligible for resubmit thing, we'll see. But anywho, before we super get into that, does anybody have anything that they worked on last week for their work in progress that they want to look at and get feedback from the class? Okay. So this week I'm probably going to be kind of like loosey-goosey with that. I can't believe I just said loosey-goosey. But next week we will definitely be looking at the work in progress animations in class, as well as probably doing some more in-class crit for the upcoming weeks. Bless you. It seems like this week most people have still been kind of like really pushing hard with the rigging, so there might be less sort of meaningful things to look at in terms of the environment. Anywho, so last call. Anyone want to look at anything? All right. So work in progress animation. This is basically showing the work in progress animation that hopefully you will have done by then. But yeah, so ideally this should be more than just blocking. I do have some sort of like examples of what exactly I mean in terms of like, if you look at the grading, like what would qualify as like, you know, exceedingly rough by my standards versus something that would be, you know, more polished. So I'll go over that once we actually break into the Maya file. But basically there's two things that I would like you to submit with this. One is a video with all of your individual animations in that video. So any animations you worked on up to this point, blocking, more refined, whatever, throw that into one video. This is the thing that I'm going to be looking at for grading. Because again, I'm grading, there's like some stuff that's sort of group projects, but I'm grading the individual animation separately as individual work. Because presumably you're only really going to have one person working on each scene. So again, this is what I'm grading. If you could also just throw up a video of just like the full team's animation to sort of cut together into your final clip. This is probably what we're going to look at in class, just because it'll help actually have context to what's happening, so it's not just like a bunch of random 5-second clips of random things happening. So when we look at stuff in class, you'll kind of get group feedback about like all the animation and all the different scenes, if that makes sense. And if you don't have animations for something, you're welcome to just sort of sub in your reference or just sort of omit that. I'll just kind of like be the judge, like whatever kind of makes sense for your clip is totally fine. I mostly do just want that for sort of context and class critique. And as for the last animation assignments that we did, playblasts are fine if you, I think I added these settings recently, and I'll go over sort of setting up nice playblasts in class, but make sure that your playblasts are like full HD render size. Some notes about how to actually do that, and again, I'll go over this in a second. And turn off all the unnecessary stuff in your scene. So I don't want to see controllers, joints, any of that nonsense. I only want the geometry or things that would actually be in a final render. The reason being, it looks messy, and it actually can sometimes, if you have like joints and stuff everywhere, or like controllers, sometimes it does actually kind of detract from the animation and like make it hard to see what's going on depending on how much of that stuff is in the scene. And again, sort of theoretically, maybe 30 to 50% of your animation should be blocked in like a pseudo-reasonable state for this assignment, ideally. But that's basically what you're submitting for this. Here's my sort of weird little point breakdown of like 0 to 3 would be like exceedingly rough animation. 3 to 5 is like, it looks like, you have the bones there of like something kind of reasonable where it's like you've started getting sort of secondary motion, like physically plausible stuff in there. It's just maybe a little bit jerky and like obviously needs refining. 5 to 7 is, more refining basically than the rest of it. Yeah. What to submit? Two videos. One is, again, a compressed video of those individual animations, either in MP4 or MOV format, as well as the compressed video of like everyone's animations thrown together. So if you could each just submit this, just like make it together, have one person make it, but submit it with each submission. It just kind of makes my life a little bit easier. And again, MP4 or MOV for that. And when I say wait, what am I saying? When I say compressed, again, I do mean with media encoder or similar. So one thing I saw with a lot of the Playblasts was like super ginormous files. And super ginormous being like, it was a 5-second video that was like 400 megs. And it took me a really long time to download all of this stuff. So when you are going through for your next submission, again, if you just throw it into media encoder and re-export it as MP4 or MOV and compress it at the same time, it should take like an extra 2 minutes. And it also is going to ensure that Blackboard Learn doesn't try to reject any of your footage. Especially if you run like a 40-second Playblast or whatever, it's going to be enormous. But that's pretty much that assignment. Does anybody have any questions on that? Cool. Other thing I just wanted to point out, in case I think I did before, but sometimes I do get deja vu. So I do have these sort of standard formatting guidelines that are linked on pretty much, I think, every submission that I make. Just going over, like, if these are your, if you're submitting renders, this is the appropriate, like, size and format, whatnot they should be. Same thing for videos, additional information if there's, like, playblasting required, etc., other information. Just anytime you have questions about, like, what format you should submit stuff, it's pretty much all in this document. So I just wanted to point that out and make sure you guys were aware of it. I've also gone through and linked it in somewhere. If you just go into the assignments, I just threw a link in there for grins, so you can find it there as well if you're ever just looking for it. But yeah, that is pretty much all of the assignment stuff. The only other thing that I sort of want to point out, which I feel like I mentioned this before, but again, I teach 3 classes, sometimes I get deja vu, is there's a bunch of random stuff that's just sort of due finals week. So if you guys were ever wondering where the submissions were for like the robot texture or your room models or your room textures, it's all due finals week, so it's all just sort of in the finals week folder. You guys are more than welcome, I think I've said this before, but you guys are more than welcome to submit stuff like the robot texture, room models, and textures early if you have them done. I will grade them early, and then you guys can pretty much just keep resubmitting them until the end of the quarter if you want. Either just to get it out of the way, or you want to, if you got extra time, you can like work to boost whatever grades you feel need boosting, that kind of thing. Alternately, it's just going to be a bunch of different random submissions on finals week. I am asking for individual submissions for all of these things. I do apologize if it's slightly convoluted, but that is the format that I am experimenting with this quarter. But that's pretty much that. So, any questions about assignments, etc., before we just jump into the sort of weird animation demo thing that I have for you guys? Cool. Anybody have a preference? Again, lights off, lights on? Okay. So, what? Sweet. I'm happy with that. I think this room gets kind of terrifying and dark, honestly. All right. So I've made for you this really crappy animation. You will notice that my rig is broken. The eyes do not follow the head. So for the record, I made this in like 20 minutes at 10:30 last night with no reference. It's really janky. So this is the sort of really goofy walk I have. You'll notice for one, it's playing really fast. If that's ever an issue, like this is clearly not real time, just right click on your time slider and go to playback speed. And in this case, it was set to play every frame, just however fast you can process it. In this case, I'm just going to do real time. It should, with minimal stuff in my scene, slow it down pretty much to whatever the actual timing would be. So this is my janky walk cycle. It's pretty goofy. The head's kind of like glitching out. The eyes are flipping all over the place. So I'm going to show you a few ways. I'm going to show you some stuff that I did in this animation, as well as 1 or 2 things I usually do to start cleaning up animation. But really quick, I just wanted to show you guys I made some animation layers for this. I'll probably go over this later. It was mostly just convenient for demoing. So examples of sort of like what would qualify as like exceedingly rough for next week's animation. So you guys have an idea of that. So something like this is what I would qualify as like pretty rough. Really all I've done, the legs are pretty much finished. The torso, or like the hips and the pelvis are kind of starting to move with the rest of the body. It's not really synced up very well. Yep.
I guess like out of like from 1 to 7, what would you probably grade, like if stuff like this like throughout the submission is similar to walking like that?
Probably, so that's a fair point. I'm gonna look at 2 things for that. One is, do you have, assuming each person is doing about 20 seconds of animation, do you have 20 seconds of this, or do you have like 5 seconds of this? Because obviously, you know, doing more animation counts for something. So I'd probably look at this, assuming I had the full 20 seconds, maybe somewhere like a 3 to 4-ish, maybe. Maybe, I don't know, it's pretty gross. Yeah, so maybe somewhere around like a 3 to 4. If you had like 5 seconds of this, probably like 1 to 3, depending on how janky it is. Does that sort of help as a metric? Should I?
Like, I don't know. Do you prefer like less but like more quality animation, or like more but like rougher animation?
I'm gonna say that depends largely on how you work. So personally, I work as like one-shot animation where I just go through and I animate the whole thing and get it to a pretty finished state like on the first pass, because I just find it hard to work otherwise. So like for something like that, I'd be like, okay, clearly you spent, you know, a lot of time refining that one animation so it looks nicer, so you'd still get like a higher grade for that. But yeah, I guess I don't super have a preference what you do. If you're gonna do less animation, it should be more refined if you want to get that higher grade, if that makes sense. Does anyone else have any questions along the same lines or anything? Or anything else? All right. Anyone want me to grade my janky animation as I go? All right. I will judge myself harshly. All right, but yeah, so again, this is like what I would qualify as like relatively unrefined. And again, like you can see, I've pretty much not done anything. Like I've literally done nothing to the upper part of the body. I've just sort of moved the hands down. But the hands and feet are sort of getting, or the feet and pelvis are sort of getting toward this where they need to be. And I have some reasonable stuff going on for the feet. They're like popping a little bit right now. But they're like, all the motion of the toes and stuff is like pretty much there. So again, that's sort of like the more or less minimum I would expect. I've gone through and I've added some, wow, what am I doing? I've added some better pelvis movement in this animation layer. So really quick, just, again, I'm not gonna probably go over these like super in depth, but you can make, like right next to the display layer tab, there's these little animation layers. Basically, if you want to add, you pretty much create them just like display layers, and they function more or less like a layer in Photoshop, where you can add keyframes or animations on a specific layer and then turn them on or off at your leisure. Honestly, I almost never use these. I find that whenever I do, I can't keep them straight and I forget that I make them and then they get really messy. But I know some people that use them with great effect. You can see sort of this is basically like the mute or unmute button or like visibility for each layer. So as I toggle that, it is actually changing the animation that's happening on the pelvis of this character. So this is just sort of how I'm controlling things. I don't think it makes a lot of sense for the setup that I did in this case to organize it the way I did. It would be convenient for demonstration purposes, so that's why I did it. But anywho, so this is the sort of like slightly more refined, but still extremely janky pelvis, where you can see it's like rotating back and forth. There's a little bit more motion here. And this is sort of the one where if you look at it from the side, it fixes some but not all of the sort of weird leg stuff that's happening, where the leg was like pulling away from the ground, that kind of thing. There's still some IK popping towards the end, but it's like kind of getting a little bit better. This is something I would still qualify as like pretty rough animation, but slightly better than what I did before. And again, I've not done anything to the upper part of the body in this. It also is like actually pretty not terrible way to sort of view how aggressive the hip rotation I usually put on my characters are. Because you can see like the whole upper body is just like swaying aggressively as this thing walks. So don't be afraid to do that. Again, this was like super rough, done in 20 minutes with no reference, but don't be afraid to really like shift the hips of the character around. Other thing I actually want to point out about this really quick is I have literally no keyframes, and this is personal preference how I like working. I have literally no keyframes on this pelvis controller at all. The only thing that I am keyframing in this case is the root, and that's just because I personally like counter keying the upper part of the body. I feel like it helps me get more natural body motion. I just wanted to kind of point that out. Just don't be afraid. Like, the pelvis controller is there. Don't feel like you have to use it if you don't want to. But anywho. So I've also gone through, and in this layer, I've done a little bit of counter keying with the upper part of the body, so you can see that instead of flopping back and forth haphazardly, it's getting a little bit more refined. I have some secondary motion in the head. It's pretty bad and entirely unrefined and janky. So this is something, if you had something maybe like this, with like a little bit of arm blocking in, is something that I would sort of qualify as like the sort of like medium to slightly higher end of the grades for this upcoming assignment, because you have, again, like pretty decent looking legs, and then you've gone through and you're sort of starting to really block in the motion of the body. You can kind of like see the weight of the character being distributed, get the feel of the walk a little bit if it's doing something like super sassy versus, you know, clutching a stab wound in its side or something weird like that. I've also gone through for some reason and added a Sassy Feet layer in this. Just sort of the difference. You can see in this layer, it's almost like the character is like walking along a tightrope or trying to do some kind of insane catwalk. This layer actually will fix a lot of the IK popping because I designed it to work with that Sassy Feet. No, it doesn't. Apparently there's just IK popping in this. Great. But that's just like a weird sort of extra thing I did just because I think it's fun. And then layer with the arms flailing around. The motion of this makes no sense for the most part. But one thing I did sort of want to demonstrate, because this is actually something that I saw a lot in the walking motions, was really, really stiff arms, where it looks like the whole arm was like mostly only keyed at the shoulder. And that is good for, it's like definitely good for blocking in. In terms of sort of refining animation, it's not necessarily the most natural. So if you, I mean, this one's extremely floppy. If you look at this one, it kind of does a little bit like flopping back and forth. Like, even if it's a robot, it feels pretty fluid and robotic. Sadly, I think this arm is literally my favorite part of the entire animation I've done, which makes me sad. But basically, I put that in because I kind of wanted to show you guys how I sort of did that. So this is something, for the record, like this sort of final thing is what I would qualify to like, again, the sort of maybe like high, like low end of the highest quality grades, I guess, where it's like you have some secondary motion in there, especially like in the arms, and again, you have all the sort of steps there. It just sort of needs to go through and like polish it so it's not super jerky and horrible looking. But this is like, again, kind of what I'd be hoping to see for like the rough animations. Does that make sense? I mean, that was pretty much the sort of like grading explanation. Does that kind of make sense? Does anyone have questions about that? All right. This thing terrifies the crap out of me.
Why do you have the eye controller still back at the origin?
Because I found a problem with my rig when I was animating. I just didn't feel like fixing it.
How do you get around it? Because I know a couple of friends who were having that trouble. And
Gotcha.
The cheat I did was just putting in a different group.
Yeah.
Putting it in the group, and then it just forced it to work.
So, I mean, that honestly is probably what I need to do here. I would imagine that I set this up, and I think, okay, so I'm not actually going to go into the rig file and fix this, but I can probably tell you why this is broken. So if we look at this, like the sockets and pretty much everything on this body, I've skinned this to the model. And the reason I can tell just sort of by looking at it that I've skinned it versus constraining it is when you skin something, it's going to lock, translate, rotate, and scale. Normally, if you constrain it with something like a parent constraint, it's only going to lock the translation and rotation. So that's my sort of quick check of how have I attached this. I can confirm that by looking in my outliner and saying, okay, this is definitely following the rig, like this piece of geometry, following the rig, and there's no constraint under it or any group that that is attached to, so I've bound that skin. In this case, it looks like what I've done is just sort of left this piece of geometry here. It's not been attached at all to anything. It's, there's no locked values from constraints or skin binding. So I think I literally just put this in for a demonstration video and completely forgot to attach it to the head at all. In the case of another, the other thing that I see sometimes, sort of frequently, is like, if you grab, for example, and this is gonna be really, really janky. So let me just say, if I grab, like this group, right? Like this group has all of the eye stuff in it. You can bulk attach things by grabbing the joint and then that group and doing a constraint, like a parent constraint to that. I imagine this might cause some issues because the skin is attached twice. Yes, double transformation, guys. But you can see that the eyes are now following the head. Not that this is preferable, but this is one of those instances where I imagine sort of like the reverse issue that your friend might have been having, where instead of not moving at all, it's moving too much. And in this case, I could fix that by just grabbing these. Hello. Give me any eye socket, thank you. I could fix that by grabbing those eye sockets and just moving them out of this group that I've constrained, and then theoretically, my head should sort of behave like a head, even though the eyes aren't fixed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool.
That's similar to the issue. I don't know if it was just because that was just geometry, but it was like on the base joint skeleton, it would have like just the right shoulder joint stay in the origin and just stretch.
Oh, that's fun.
Right, but then when you pulled that right shoulder out, and it literally just slid it right back in, it caused it to snap back to where it was supposed to be for the whole animation, no problem.
That's super questionable. That I would have to take a look at.
Okay.
My guess would be sometimes if you have like a scale or something on, like a scale and translation values, it'll cause the stretching. I'm not sure about the snapping, yeah. I could take a look at that.
Snap, it was like it just stayed locked in place, but then
Oh,
when
that's
you pulled
weird.
it out of the hierarchy and then put it right back where it's supposed to be in the hierarchy, it worked.
I could take a look at that. That's
Okay.
very strange.
I'll have her send you a copy if it happens again.
Sounds good.
For now, I tried that and it fixed the whole thing, and it currently hasn't.
Interesting.
So.
Maya is the weirdest thing ever. Anywho. Any other questions and stuff? All right. But yeah, so just ignore the fact the eyes are shamelessly not following anything right now. Where did I leave off? I was just about to start showing you guys refining animations. Yes, was that the thing? Okay. But yeah, so normally the first thing I do, don't crash on me. Don't you dare crash. Really? Guys, it's not animation 2 unless Maya crashes at least twice a class. All right. Oh my. Okay, we'll see how usable this becomes. So usually what I do for animation is once I've sort of blocked everything in and have everything kind of moving all right, I'll go back in and I will look in my graph editor and sort of start cleaning up keyframes. So if you go into Windows, I'm just gonna, give me 5 seconds, I'm gonna close Maya and reopen this. It's great until like 10 minutes in, and then it's just like, no. But basically, my spiel on the graph editor is I don't think I used this until after I got out of college, because I was just like, this is confusing, I don't want to deal with this. And then I was like, I used it, and I'm like, my God, I just saved myself 10 hours of time. I really wish I used this in college. It's weird to get used to using, but once you figure out how to use it and like a good workflow for you in the graph editor, it becomes incredibly, incredibly powerful. It's alive. Wait for it. Well, this doesn't feel promising in terms of non-lag. Did you? Really? Haha, it's alive again. All right. Yes, lovely. All right. So refining animations. And actually, one or two quick things I did just want to point out really quickly about the rig itself is I do have display layers set up, so I can really, really easily hide like all the controls. I can turn off the skin of the robot, set that to be referenced so I can't select it. That I found particularly helpful when animating because I'm really bad about accidentally selecting skins. So if you guys want to set something like this up for your, again, like controls, skeleton, skin, this will get you a point of extra credit on your rigs. Haha. I'm not going to lie, part of the reason, A, it's just nice to animate, and B, it makes my life a lot easier when looking at your rigs if I need to turn off your skin. The other thing I've done, which I think I made a quick little like video tutorial on, completely optional, but this is not better in terms of lag at all. Oh my. I'm trying to select this hand joint. There we go. There we go. But I've added some custom attributes on the on that little control to just sort of like automatically bend the fingers. So it'll just bend, you know, all the joints at once. It makes it a little bit easier if you need to do just like generic hand poses or do like a really quick sort of pose with things. I think it makes makes animating a lot easier because that way it saves me having to go through and be like, okay, which controls are the correct finger and like what is happening with all my controls. You will notice there is a random thumb control that is floating casually outside my scene. Don't know what's causing that, fix it later. But just like another, again, sort of like handy, easy thing to sort of deal with and fix. All right, so let's see if I can actually function in this program and use the hypergraph. Real time, excellent. So if you go to Windows, Animation Editors, I'm sorry, I've been saying hypergraph. I mean graph editor. I do this every time because they both have the word graph in it, and I can't, my brain doesn't like that. It will open, eventually. There we go. Okay. So basically what this is a visual representation of how a particular object is moving in your scene. So this shows you all of the keyframes on your object. In this case, it's also showing me the keyframes on these different display layers, these different animation layers. Because it's like separate keyframes per animation layer. If you don't use animation layers, it'll just show you a big list of all of these and have done with it. So I'm just going to look at the ones on better pelvis layer for now to keep things straightforward. And again, this is basically a graphical representation of how your characters are moving and how all of their translate, rotate, scale values are changing throughout the scene. So if you're looking for this, or if you're looking at this, the x-axis on the bottom is basically ranging from however many frames the thing is keyed on. So in this case, it's like 0 to 80-ish. And then the vertical y-axis is just the literal value of whatever that frame is. If you are ever looking at this and you're like, well, this is a mess, how do I interpret this? You can go through and click on individual attributes or individual, different attributes at once to highlight them so you can actually see what the heck is going on, because Like this is just awful to look at. Nobody expects you to look at that and be like, ah yes, I understand exactly what's happening here. They do also color code, like anything with the x-axis is usually red, y is green, and then z is blue. That seems to be my sort of standard coloring if they're going to color the axes. So we'll start looking at the translate y of this and see if there's anything, just sort of like see what's happening with this frame. So basically, at frame 0, we have a value of somewhere around -2 for our y, which means that I've taken this and I've shifted the position down a little bit. And as you scrub through your animations, you can kind of see, again, visually, as the character's hips are sort of dropping down here, that value is reflected here. So I mean, in terms of translate y, it's like a pretty literal, like if there's a curve going upwards, the object is rising into the air. If it's going downwards, the object is being lowered. So that's, I mean, I think that's like the easiest one to sort of look at in terms of like how to actually interpret what's going on is usually translate y. Rotates get a little bit harder to figure out what's exactly going on. But does that make sense? Like, does it make sense, like, sort of how you look at it and, like, what's happening in the graph editor? Okay. So I'll show you my sort of, like, 2 or 3 things that I usually do immediately. Like, as soon as I've done blocking stuff in, I'll go through and I'll do these things. The first one is I will go through and I will just be like, all right, where in this curve are there what I call extra keyframes, or like keyframes that are barely doing anything to the shape of this curve? I'm just going to go in and delete them. So in this case, and for the record, these little yellow diamond things are keyframes. You can also, you'll notice, wait, this is, all right, let me just go to translate y. So you will notice that if I select one of these keyframes and move it around, you can actually modify your animation in the graph editor, right? Like I can move this up super crazy high to actually just adjust animation purely in the graph editor. You can also go through if you want and like change the position of the keyframe. So if I grab this and I drag it backwards, it should poke another little keyframe right onto frame 24 where my animation is. But it can be really handy to just sort of tweak, you know, subtle things if you need to, or like it's a good way to sort of shift animations if you need to. It's really easy to just sort of go through and drag all of these, grab all these keyframes and just be like, drag them, you know, to a different frame range. The graph editor is also, every once in a while, I'll point out like, you can key this attribute, but it doesn't show up down here. It doesn't show up on your time slider. Graph editor is like pretty much the only way I've found to actually find, locate, and modify or delete those keyframes. So it is somewhat necessary actually for that. Anywho. So in terms of actually, again, editing things, ooh, hello. Yes. Again, usually what I'll do is just sort of go through and be like, again, what's not really affecting the shape of this curve all that much? So I'm going to say, grab this thing and just sort of delete that. And obviously as you're doing this, you do want to make sure, like that one kind of changed the graph kind of dramatically. So what you can do, and you can always do this in the graph editor, is modify the sort of, they work just like Bezier curves in Illustrator. But you can grab the little handle next to this and sort of rotate it around to change the curve that way. If you made it like super aggressively curve downwards like that, that is, again, going to affect the translation of this character. So it's going to, instead of just sort of smoothly going upwards, it's going to dip down fairly aggressively before moving upwards again. Ooh, the lag. Okay. I might need to restart my again. But that's usually sort of, again, where I start is just sort of deleting extra keyframes. And what this does, I found that like when I usually animate stuff, I have this insane habit of setting like way too many keyframes on things, and it's like really, really minute, like down here. It's extremely minute value adjustments to the point where it's sort of affecting the overall curve, but in such a negligible way that like I don't really need that keyframe there. most, like 99% of the time. If you delete it, your animation is going to pretty much look and function the same. And by getting rid of some of those little keyframes, a lot of times in my personal animations, it gets rid of a lot of weird extra jitter. So before I started using the graph editor, I would set so many frames. Like I would, have a frame, or have a keyframe set like literally every frame, trying to adjust some tiny, minute rotational thing that was wrong with my animation. And in the graph editor, I was like, oh, it's just because I have 8,000 frames in here. Like, let me just delete all of these little ones, and it pretty much usually will fix a lot of the jitter almost immediately. So that's a really, really handy thing to go through and do just whenever you're doing stuff. I'll try another sort of random animation. This one actually doesn't look too bad. But again, that's usually the first thing I do, is just like visually, oh, this, like this little thing right here is pretty much erg. Of course, I change it right when I find a decent one. I might restart Maya again. We'll see. This is bad. It usually gives me at least 10 minutes before it gets this bad. But again, like this curve right here on the rotate Z? Question mark? What are you doing, Maya? It's not even, psh. Okay, this is why display layers confuse the crap out of me. Animation layers, because it's in the different animation layer, and that's why I couldn't find the keyframes. But this particular one has a lot of those like weird little sort of dead frames. But like right here, like all of these, such a negligible change, I'm just gonna go ahead and delete them. Not really gonna make a huge difference for my animation. Same thing with this one and this one. Usually just go through and delete them. And the other thing this does, apart from having the potential to sort of reduce jitter in your animation, it's way easier to look at this. Like you have a really obvious like 1 point, 1 point, 1 point. Like you can pretty visually see how this arm is like swinging back and then forward and then back and then kind of leveling out. So it makes it easier to sort of modify things. You're not fighting with these extra keyframes. If you're like, oops, maybe, I don't want this to rotate so far back, you can just drag that up and not worry about all those extra frames there. So it does make it also a little bit easier to work with. Does anybody have any questions about sort of deleting extra frames or like manipulating frames in the graph editor or keyframes? All right. What the heck? Wait. Okay. There's like one other thing that I do with the graph editor, and for some reason, I'm completely forgetting what it is, which is insane. That's really weird. Okay. Anyway. The other thing that I wanted to sort of point out, assuming I can actually make this work, is how I did the secondary animation, or like the sort of swinginess in a lot of these arms. So right now I'm just going to go through and pull up the rotate Z of, if Maya will let me do this and not explode, I will pull up the rotate Z of all of these shoulders, arms, and wrists and show you sort of visually where I've set the keyframes for these. We'll see if this actually works or not, but usually to make that sort of exceedingly floppy animation that I showed you before, like with the arm, oh my god, the lag. It's the same keyframes as if you were to say, put the arm back and like set a specific position, and then you just sort of shift a few frames around. So basically what we have, if we're going through and looking at this, is one keyframe sort of around frame 10, and that's going to be the shoulder going sort of swinging backwards for the first time. If we go forward, you'll notice that there is sort of another keyframe here, and usually what I'll do is I'll go through, so I'll have the shoulder go all the way back, and then I'll go 2 or 3 frames forward, and that's the time when the elbow is going to swing to the backmost position that the elbow is ever going to be in. And the way I don't know if this sort of comparison makes sense, but it's like if you've ever grabbed like a ribbon or a piece of string and just like flailed it through the air, as you hold that ribbon and you change the positioning of your hand, the piece of string closest to your hand changes position before that change sort of ripples through to the rest of the ribbon, if that makes sense. So it's not like you have this like curvy piece of ribbon that doesn't move at all as you sway it through the air. And that's kind of the same thing that happens with the hand, if that makes any sense at all. So as you move the main body, or like the hand holding the ribbon, it's gonna move your shoulder first, and then that change is gonna sort of flow through to the rest of the arm or the hands, etc. And I think the graph editor in this case is not a great way to demo this. So I'm just gonna show you the frames themselves on the arm layer. So in this case, it's actually frame 19, where the arm swings as back as it ever goes before it starts coming forward again. So that's, again, frame 19. This one is as back as it's ever going to get. If we look at the elbow, you'll notice that that is keyframed like 2 frames after that, frame 21. And the hands, which I've decided to make just exceptionally floppy and insane looking, is keyed 2 frames after that at frame 23. So a decent way to sort of get that really sort of fluid animation, and you can kind of see it hopefully as you move the arm forward, where like the shoulder stops coming forward around frame 40 and then it starts to sort of fall backwards, whereas the elbow is still flexing ever so slightly. That's actually stops bending at frame 45, and this is when it starts bending, so the arm is a little bit straighter. And same thing for the hand. So this shoulder was frame 40, 45, and this one apparently I've also done at frame 45. But it does sort of help give that like extra fluid motion. So this is something that you can look at a lot in your animations. If not for the blocking stage, then going through when you're refining things is sort of staggering the motions of when things happen. One thing you really want to avoid is like super obvious, like, oh, there's a keyframe there where like the entire upper half of the body has keyframes at that one frame, and it's just like changing the position of everything at once. It makes everything look like really, really fake most of the time when that's happening. So the other thing you can go through and look at is, this is sort of like floppy arm thing makes sense, like if you guys were to try to replicate that, kind of makes sense. Okay. The other thing that you can do is look at, again, where is areas of secondary motion. So you can see, I have it on the toes for everything. It's particularly obvious on this last footstep where the robot is like putting her foot down for the last time. So we have the heel touches the ground, and the heel's rolling down, and then you have this like 1 or 2 frames, bless you. You have those 1 or 2 frames at the end where the toe is sort of like falling down afterwards. Just like a little bit, it's like a super stupidly subtle thing, but it makes the animation look a little bit more fluid. Obviously that doesn't make sense for all of the different foot designs that you guys have done, but where applicable it is like a nice thing to put in if you're so inclined. Only other thing I think I want to talk about is IK popping, and this is a really, really bad one. So IK popping is basically, an extreme version of an IK pop is this, where the legs, honestly, this is like, I do this for fun sometimes, just like counting sheep. But it's basically when the legs hyperextend because the body is too far away from the controller for the legs to actually reach. There's no, as far as I'm aware, there is no magical fix to automatically find and correct these. You just need to go through like and look in your animation like, okay, I feel like I deleted some frames or something because that feels really, but like just look for, really, this one's particularly obvious, like I said. The fix for that is literally just go through, grab the root controller and be like, all right, I think something got kind of janky around here because this is still hyperextended, so let me just push that down a little bit. Set a keyframe on my translate Y, and it's still like a little bit poppy. Basically, it's just a matter of sort of shifting the root into place so that that's not happening. And you can go through and do that in a bunch of different ways. You can try to either rotate it to even the difference out. In this case, it looks like I might need to sort of shift it down and back. And you'll notice it's like a pretty immediate thing. Like once you get it into position, that leg sort of relaxes a little bit. And that's pretty much what you need to do to sort of fix an IK popping, is just kind of go through and like massage the animation a little bit until it doesn't pop. It's tedious. It's not a particularly satisfying answer. I wish there was a way to like automatically fix this, but that's just sort of like, you just gotta watch out for them. So for the record, if I ever say like, oh, there's an IK pop there, that's what I'm talking about, and that's how you fix it. You can, I mean, they're annoying. You can kind of look at them almost as a good thing, maybe, because it shows you if, it's a very visual way of being like, ah, yes, this is not moving in a realistic way, where like the leg, like this physically needs to come back more because I'm doing something to break my character, if that makes sense. You can also go in this case and potentially, if you like pop the tippy toe a little bit more, like that would also fix it, and that's just like a 2-degree change or whatever that I did in that. There's always different ways to fix that, but basically you just need to like relieve the pressure on the leg. That is, I think, pretty much all of the sort of random refining of animation stuff I had for you guys this week. Anybody have any questions on that? I do want to go over Playblast settings, but questions on that before we go over? All right. So Playblast settings really quick. First of all, again, turn off all your random controls and stuff in your scene. Don't want to see them. So this is pretty much all you should be left with, is just geometry or any renderables. Right click on your time slider and just pull up the settings for Playblast. For some reason, Maya on Windows, oh, that's what I wanted to talk about. Maya on Windows is like, you can either do an image sequence or AVIs. So I've been doing AVIs and then just, again, swap it to MP4 MOV when you compress your stuff. But there's 3 settings that I usually pay attention to. Quality, which is, in my opinion, kind of like the 3rd most important of all of these. If you leave it at 70, it's probably not going to kill anything. Set it up to 100 if you want your Playblast to look really nice. The most important setting, in my opinion, for a Playblast is the scale of your Playblast. At 0.5, it is going to render at half of the specified size. So I think I got this a lot for Playblast, where they're like super, super tiny and super grainy. So for all of your Playblasts, they should still be at 1920 by 1080, full render size of decent quality. To actually make that happen, you do need to set your scale up to 1. And the other thing you want to do is, for the display size, set this to be from render settings. What this is going to do, so from window is basically whatever size your viewport is. And if you make your viewport, dang it, Maya. Hang on. I swear I actually know how to use a computer. All right, if you do this, and you make your viewport this size and this shape, and you apply this, it's going to kick you out of video that pretty much looks like an insane strip of this character's pelvis just like floating around. Hopefully it will open that. Yes. It will give you this. That is not what you want for an animation. Its viewport size is such an incredibly arbitrary thing, dependent on how you have your computer set up on your screen, your monitor size. It is like the least precise way possible to do things. So what you guys are going to want to do is not use from window, do from render settings, and then just make sure that your renders or your image size is set to 1920 by 1080, full HD. What that should do is actually render you out a properly sized image at the correct aspect ratio. So if you're trying to test camera angles and stuff like that and get feedback on that, that's also really important. And this looks significantly less insane than the last one did. So this is the settings that I would like to see for Playblast, is again, just like nice clear image with like not a lot of extra stuff in your scene. But it should be, again, kind of like large enough and decent quality to view. Does that make sense? Sweet. So I realized I maybe was not super specific with the last assignment. Going forward, again, I'll be a little bit pickier with like the settings for the Playblast in the future. 2 other things you can do that's just like entirely not mandatory, but does sort of help sweeten the overall look of things. There's these 2 buttons here, sort of 3, but You can turn on anti-aliasing, which is going to make things look a little bit cleaner around the edges. So I have no idea if this shows up on the projector. It's usually pretty gross in controls. But like you'll notice right around the edge of the character or like the controllers, there's a little, it's like kind of pixely and gross. If you turn on anti-aliasing, it'll smooth that out and make things look a lot cleaner. Works for Playblasts. I usually turn it on whenever possible because it also just makes my controllers look a little bit crisper, which like my eyes notice, and it makes me happier when they're smooth. And the other thing that you can turn on is screen space ambient occlusion, and that is 2 buttons left of the anti-aliasing. And that will basically put in tiny fake shadows around your character, which is particularly helpful if you're looking like at the ground. You'll notice like right now, this character is standing on the ground, but since there's no shadows, it can be kind of hard. It's gonna sound really dumb. It can be kind of hard to tell that they're standing on the ground. By putting that screen space ambient occlusion in, it gives the viewer a sense of like, oh, okay, clearly those feet are connected to something. Versus, you know, doing this. Without that ambient occlusion, you have no way of telling if it's on the ground or not, whereas like here, you at least have some sort of like fake shadow that's visually indicating that they're touching the ground. It sounds really stupid, but it does also make your playlist look just nicer, and it usually doesn't eat up processing power, so I just kind of throw that in as well. That is pretty much how to make halfway decent looking playblasts and animation things. Does anybody have any questions about that before we move on to trees and other stuff? Sweet. One thing I did want to address, like someone asked, and I don't remember if I told this to you guys, but someone asked like what's the best way to sort of pass files between each other as you're working as a team on these animation projects. So I think I've actually gone through possibly on the syllabus, which is weird. I think in the future I'm just going to sort of reorganize some of this stuff. Maybe it wasn't the syllabus. Maybe it was like the robot rig. I honestly don't remember where I put this. I'm going to find it and like put it somewhere less insane so you guys can actually find it. But usually what I'd recommend doing is deciding on a file structure as a team and then sort of attaching all of your files in there wherever it makes sense. So like if this is your project folder, usually what I'll do is something where you have, and again, this is like if I'm sharing files with a bunch of people, I'll just make a folder for like referenced files, and any of the shared rigs, the environment, anything that you are referencing into your scene, you're gonna just dump in here. The reason that I do this, especially if you're working with other people, it makes things really easy to keep the same file structure between everybody. It's clear what you're looking for. It's clear which files you should be looking at if for some reason you have like a big list of like different versions of the same rig. So straightforward in that way. Again, file paths should link up really easily. I would also usually do the same thing in like my source images folder. So do like what am I clicking right now? Any buttons where you just have like referenced textures. And then you'd have all of your textures in here. The textures especially, I would also recommend adding some additional subfolders for, so like character 1 versus character 2, because usually, you know, if you get like 5 textures, it's kind of like enough to justify its own folder, I think. And the other benefit of doing this is especially if you split it by character, each person, like if you for some reason need to update those files, delete the whole folder, get the new folder from your teammate, dump it in, and all the files should theoretically link up correctly. So this goes, again, for environmental stuff. Like whatever you guys are passing between each other, I recommend just dumping them in their own organized little folders. Make sure you decide on some kind of naming convention, ideally. But that's usually how I organize stuff. And from there, it's pretty much just everyone working on their own animations, stuff like that individually, and you can organize things, you know, however you want. Does that make sense? Okay. The only other thing that I would suggest, and this is entirely optional, if you are going to be setting up a bunch of different scenes with a bunch of different characters, set up one scene with all of the stuff in it, and then just go from there. And what I mean by that is like, start a new Maya scene, reference in, you know, if you have 3 characters that need to be in that scene, reference all 3 characters in. You can always hide them if one of them isn't used in that particular scene. Put in all of the environment stuff you need. and set everything up with, the display layers and stuff like that, how you like it. If your characters weren't built to scale them in that scene, and then anytime that's just sort of ready to go, don't keyframe anything in it. If you need to start doing an animation, you can just grab that file, duplicate it, and start animating in that. So it should still have all of your characters, stuff like that in it. It just saves you setting up the same thing a bunch of different times and ensures that everyone has the same scale for their characters, that kind of thing. But yeah, honestly, there's like a bunch of different ways to sort of organize stuff. That's just how I like doing it and how I recommend doing it. It's like a pretty sane workflow to me. But yeah. Anybody have any questions on that? All right, cool. So in that case, moving on to, so last week we did some ZBrush environment stuff. I saw at least 1 or 2 people in my last class were playing around with that. So like I said before, this is the sort of part 2 that we have. And that is going to be basically taking stuff like trees, the auto-generated trees in Maya, putting them into ZBrush for an assortment of different reasons I'll kind of get to, and then dumping them back into Maya if you need to use them. So first is actually making said default trees in Maya. So if you go into Windows, General Editors, don't dare crash on me, in Content Browser, it'll pull up eventually. Content Browser has a bunch of random predefined things just sort of floating around in it. By default, it takes you to this lovely scene full of like alligator and big fish, just like random models you can throw into your scene. So I have a cat, let's do a cat. If we drag that in, it's literally like, here is a cat model. It's just a cat model. There's nothing fancy about this, it's just a cat. It does actually have not terrible topology, which is kind of interesting. But I mean, that's there if you want to reference it. There's a bunch of different like examples of animation, examples of mesh things. There's like a bunch of different stuff here that you can play with. In this case, what I'm interested in, apart from Maya not being terrible and laggy, is the Paint Effects tab down here, which I'll get to at some point. Okay. Oh yes, I tried to make a new scene a minute ago. Okay. All right, anywho. So if you click on this Paint Effects tab, my God, it'll pull up a bunch more stuff. There's so much weird stuff that you can play with in here. It's honestly really fun to just go and like doodle some things and see what happens. Like, oh, here's the grasses tab. Like you can just draw in grasses and flowers. They have feathers, but like it's pretty much just click and then it'll give you this weird little paintbrush and you just sort of doodle, and it draws things for you. I think I might need to restart Maya again. This is not useful or usable right now. But well, I'm starting Maya again. But Paint Effects, like I said, it has a lot of weird effects on it. Do I need to force quote you again? Every once in a while, like some of these things have actual animation just on them, which is kind of cool. So there's like different types of flowers and grasses that just sort of have like pre-baked little like wind blowing gently in the breeze kind of animation, which can be useful. Honestly, I don't use it that much. I painted fire once with Paint Effects, didn't know it animated, and then I was like rendering, I'm like, oh my God, why is my fire moving? So that was an interesting thing. I feel like the corn silk, but yeah, okay. Now it's not lagging. But you can see you can just sort of doodle and like write your name in corn stalks if, that's a thing that appeals to you. Okay, this one says dry blowing grass, so presumably this one has animation on it. So if we draw some grass, and you can see maybe that it is sort of, oh God. If you look very closely at this grass, you can see that it's kind of jiggling slightly. I'm normally better about finding ones with better animation, but we continue. So in this case, I promised you trees. Again, there are just like a bunch of different types of flowers and stuff like that if you want these. Once you put them down, they all sort of behave in a very similar way in terms of like how you edit them. So I'd encourage you guys to just sort of like play around with these, honestly. Like, it's super powerful. One thing I will note is like if you need to convert these to polygons, which I will go over. Let me actually turn on my poly count. These can add lots of geometry to your scene very, very quickly, so it's not a bad idea to pay attention to what you're actually laying down here. But anywho, so I promised you again, trees. So we'll start with a cherry tree demo. And again, same process. Click and just drag, and it will generate you some trees. And we have now a very lovely, completely illogical setup of cornstalks, cherry trees, and random flowers. In this case, I don't think the cherry tree oh my god, the cherry's animated. Great. You can see we have awkward card cherry trees gently blowing in the breeze. So one thing I actually do want to point out really quickly about paint effects stuff is most times they will not render with like Arnold or Redshift. You have to go through a few extra steps to make that a thing. By the way, you can generate carrots, which is delightful. I do that probably every time I go into paint effects. So here's my Arnold render view. I put the plane in just to prove that it is actually rendering things. There's a physical sky in here as well. And again, you can see that nothing's actually rendering with Arnold. That is not uncommon at all with most paint effects stuff. It's designed to be rendered in Maya software, which you should not be rendering your final animation in, by the way. If I see anyone rendering in Maya software and I catch you, I will find you. You will submit your work to me, literally. But if we do render this with Maya software, the lighting on the ground plane and stuff will be terrible, but wait, what is software? It should give us much better looking cherry trees and other stuff. So one thing you can do if ideally you would just sort of go through and like retexture everything for Arnold. It is entirely possible though to basically render out your grasses and your corns separately in Maya software and then composite them into your Arnold renders. You'll notice, I mean, the cherry trees are pretty janky. They do have some kind of card texture going on here to make them like break up the cards. The grass looks pretty okay. I did a lettuce in my previous class and that was really weird. But yeah, so like I said, you gotta jump through some hoops to make it render in Arnold, but they render in software if you're like really in a pinch. So just a weird note. So that is pretty much the generation of these polypaint trees. You can, if you decide, like, I am displeased with this enormous clump of cherry trees that I've generated, you'll notice it's slowing my scene down pretty immensely, and to be fair, the baseline is not very high for that. But if you do decide that once you've drawn this squiggle and you want to modify it, go into your attribute editor, and you want to find just like the cherry tree or whatever you've generated caret node. Not the stroke node, the cherry tree or whatever node thing that is. And if you go down to this tubes button here, it'll open up a crap ton of submenus. But what this lets you do is basically change the sort of parameters for the spawning that it did on these trees. So in this case, if you set tubes per step to something like 1 or 0.01 instead of 5, it's going to generate fewer trees, so now we have 2 instead of 5. I made the mistake in my previous class of setting that slider higher, and I generated like 50 cherry trees. It did not end well. But you can go through and like just sort of, this is one of those things where like I would encourage you to just like honestly play with a bunch of settings and see how it affects things. Because some things honestly is like not always entirely obvious what it's doing. In this case, apparently adding additional segments makes these branches like super curly, which is strange and interesting. You can also go through and play with like the minimum and maximum widths of these tubes. So if you needed thicker trees, you could go through and kind of thicken it like that. That actually looks pretty cool. But there's a lot of different settings that you can play with for these polypaint trees to sort of enhance them past what they originally were. So it seems like a lot of these are in the creation tab. The other thing you can do is you can play with the width scale manually if you want to. The other thing I usually do is look at this growth pattern. And this is going to be a lot of times for turning on and off different properties. So in this case, the leaves are trashing my Maya scene. I'm going to go ahead and just uncheck them. It'll get rid of my leaves. So this would be a really good way to sort of, if you like the base branches of a cherry tree, to sort of generate those and just turn off the leaves. You can add flowers, which is never a good option. They look insane. They've also, I think, crashed Maya, which is sad because I really wanted to demo on this tree. It's pretty. Ooh, flowers. Okay. Oh, holy crap. Cherry tree is literally the one tree that this is correctly put flowers on. Normally, they're enormous and like bigger than a person. I kid you not, it's crazy. But again, be careful checking these options because a lot of times they will dramatically slow down your Maya scene. I'm curious what they look like. I've never rendered a cherry blossom before on Paint Effects. Dramatically slows down renders too, apparently. All right, kind of flowery, kind of cool. Still gonna turn it off though because it's trashing everything. But again, go through, play with the settings, especially most of them are like under that tubes menu that I just showed you. It literally took 30 seconds for that to process. Oh my god. Okay. Turn off the flowers. In this case, I'm also going to go ahead and turn off twigs. It should theoretically... Okay. Hopefully it eliminated a lot of these like little itty-bitty branches. Sometimes you might just need to go through and sort of mess with like the branches, maybe. Turn off like the number of branches. So you kind of like, some of these are kind of unclear as to exactly how they work, which is why I say go through and just kind of fiddle with them. If you turn off all branches, you get this weird squiggle. But yeah. So you can kind of play with things that way, but I'm just gonna say like, hey, we got a tree. It's kind of resembles a tree. So if we are happy with this tree, there are sort of 2 or 3, if we're happy with the shape of it, there's like 2 or 3 different things you can do to it. So the first thing is if you click on this and assign it a new material, usually it doesn't get, so I'm gonna just try to turn this like bright blue. A lot of times Paint Effects does not take materials well. And when I say that, like by assigning it a new material, you would expect it to show up in Arnold, and it still doesn't. So if you want this to render in, again, Arnold or Redshift, you're gonna have to turn this into polygons. So right now you'll notice that if we look at our poly count, this is for the whole scene. We have 121 verts in this scene, and that is only from the ground plane. So none of this is registering as geometry. It's just its own weird thing. To actually convert this, you want to go into, select your poly paint, go into Modify, Convert, and there's an option just for Paint Effects to polys. So it's the same thing you would do with like NURBS to polys or anything like that. Just Paint Effects to polys instead. And in this case, you could try converting it with color or illuminated. I usually find it doesn't make a huge difference in transferring the colors and stuff over. Quad output tries to force quad output if that is relevant. I usually just turn that on. And hide stroke is basically, it won't delete it, but it'll like hide the sort of base poly paint in the outliner. And the other probably most important-ish setting is honestly this poly limit here. And this is basically, at what point do you want to, like what number of polys do you want to stop rendering your poly paint? So if you're concerned about poly count, maybe twiddle with this number a bit. If you hover over it, it will pop up a tooltip saying, hey, if you set this to 0, we're just going to do the whole poly paint. Poly count be damned, basically. Which if you're trying to spawn like 70 of these trees with leaves, will probably crash Maya. But in this case, we're doing 3, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. And it has done pretty much the promised things where it's gone through and it's hidden our original sort of cherry trees. And now, if you look at our poly count, we now have 41,000 polys instead of 121. So these are, again, pretty dense with the polygons. You will notice these are not particularly ideal tree geometries. So at this point, they should render now. Huzzah, we have trees. And now you should be able to assign them like whatever material you want, and that should be good. If we do a mesh separate on these, you'll notice, it's pretty apparent in this particular tree, for some reason they're metal, but you'll notice that this is not one nice piece of tree, it is like a bunch of different meshes just randomly clipping through each other. So if you're trying to do sort of advanced texturing on this, or if you plan on smoothing this, it's not always like the greatest thing. In this case, it like holds up pretty well here actually. But like you get up here and it's like really janky. That was, I missed a branch smoothing it. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where you do need to like really like get up right in a limb of a tree or something like that, you can see here like the smoothing doesn't quite hold up. That's like a little bit of a lip or something like that. You can go through and I usually just use ZBrush to sort of forcibly make this one solid mesh that's a little bit more manageable. So I'll show you guys how to do that. Again, this is just sort of, I have no problem if you guys are putting poly paint trees in your scene. If they're kind of far away and they don't look super janky, I have no problem with you leaving them as these sort of random clipping meshes. It's mostly just like if you're getting up really close to it, like again, stuff like this is something you'd want to watch out for, either just from forgetting to smooth it or like sometimes there's actual little blips in it. But this is the sort of like how to refine past polygon, past these trees. I'm going to get rid of some of these extra super tiny branches because I don't want to deal with them. That's a lot of tiny branches. So I'm just going to go ahead and export selection. I will call this tree. Tree. All right. And export that. And I'm going to just throw this into ZBrush. I found that this is usually the quickest, easiest way to make this tree sort of more what I want it to be. So just go into ZBrush. I'm just going to go ahead, ignore that random square, and find wherever I've dumped this tree file in my scenes. Grab the tree, left click, and just drag that into my scene. And don't forget to hit this edit button. If you don't, it's just going to forcibly keep adding trees into your scene until you click this edit button, at which point you can then rotate around, but you'll notice only one tree is rotating. Honestly, kind of looks kind of cool. But if you ever find yourself in this situation, just go to this layer tab up here in the upper left-ish and just hit clear. It'll get rid of all of those extra trees and leave you with one that you can actually use like a real person. So there's a few things that are sort of, okay, the other tree I demoed on was like a little bit more obvious, but basically this mesh, one, is clipping, which isn't ideal, but also it's not closed any of the ends of this. So, like the base is open. If you have thicker branches, all of the ends of those branches are just sort of open random pieces of geometry, which isn't super ideal. So there's 2 or 3 tools that you can use. I mentioned them very briefly last week that you can use to sort of clean this up. And pretty much all of them are under this geometry tab here. So if you open this geometry tab on the right and scroll down, the ones I'll be focusing on are Dynamesh and Z-Remesher. They do very, very similar things. So I'm going to go ahead and just scroll in on this one area in here. I'll do Shift F to open my wireframe so you can see like kind of visually where the mesh is clipping through each other. I'm just going to run a really quick Dynamesh. And you can see, it looks like there's maybe like 1 or 2 weird little mesh errors in here, but there's no clipping geometry. It's sort of gone through and like forcibly made this tree one solid mesh. It's also mostly quads. There are some tries here and there. As far as I can tell, that actually, if you're interested, works like a little bit like a automatic map in Maya for UVs, where it's just like, here's a grid, smack, goes to a different angle. Here's a grid, smack, and it just sort of blends them the best they can on the side. So that's Dynamesh. It's also going to, if you look at like the bottom of the tree, it's going to close any random open areas on this tree. So what this does is it basically goes through and tries to forcibly correct your mesh and make it a closed piece of geometry without any errors in it. If there's clipping geometry, it's going to mush them together. Z-Remesher is similar in the sense that it tries to convert everything as best it can to all quads. Interesting. It's refusing to work on this one. But it does a thing where it'll convert it to all quads, but it won't fix any holes in your mesh, and it won't join pieces together. So usually if you're trying to sort of like convert a mesh like this into a single piece, you want to hit it first with a Dynamesh. And in this case, you'll notice like when I do this, it's actually lost a lot of detail on these absurdly thin little vines here. If that's ever an issue, you can always just turn up the resolution of your Dynamesh. I usually try to make it as low as possible and still keep that resolution. So it's still losing some of these really tiny branches. I'm just going to say I really don't care about them. They're absurdly small. And you can see that it's gone through and our mesh is like super, super dense now. But it is, you know, joined together and pretty much free of errors, except for those like little bits at the end getting lost, but again, I don't really care about them. So this is usually the point where if you don't want this to look like a low poly tree, if you try to smooth this, it kind of smooths, but it takes like a really, really long time, and you still have a lot of that really obvious faceting. So this is usually where I'd come in and hit it with a Z-Remesher. So this can be a little bit finicky, like if you have, you know, certain random mesh attributes. But if we click this now, usually once you run a Dynamesh and the mesh is clean and free of errors, it'll let you do this Z-Remesh if it didn't previously. So this should be good to go through. It'll give you a little bit better edge flow, and it'll give you, really? Man, I'm trying to demo a thing. You're doing this to me. It'll give you a little bit better geometry to work with and actually allow you to smooth this out easier, except for some reason it's encountering random errors and not working. I do want to show you this. I might just generate a different tree type that I know works. Question mark. I always get really hopeful when it takes longer to process things. It did a thing! Oh my god, okay. I don't know why it suddenly worked, but I just turned the polygon count lower, and for some reason that did it. But you'll notice that this is a much lower resolution tree. It's still way too high poly to be a proper game asset, but at this point I am able to go through and sort of smooth that a little bit more aggressively if I wanted to get rid of some of those like weird faceted layer lines. So you can modify that tree as much as you want. If you decided you wanted to, you could also go in and actually sculpt in more detail into this. So, you know, maybe you wanted like some kind of weird little knot in the tree or something like that. You could poke that in if you wanted to add some, you know, different variation to the base, give it some like weird roots or something like that. And actually sculpt this, you know, so it's a little bit something like past just a generic poly paint sort of tree. Really make it something else. And again, you like put a face in it if you want to. That is pretty much usually what I will do to a mesh. Before, if I need to texture this, I would dump this back into Maya and UV it. ZBrush does have UV functionality. I'm not gonna lie, I've never even tried to use it. I usually just use Maya. But this should be relatively easy to go back into Maya and just like throw some UVs on. It is all quads, so it should be relatively easy to select things. The only other two things that I want to go over, and sometimes this works really nicely and sometimes it doesn't, is the adding of geometry to this tree. So let's assume, for one, that we've actually gone through and UV'd this in Maya or in ZBrush or wherever, and put it back into ZBrush, and now it has UVs with it. If we wanted to sculpt on this, we would go up, still in the Geometry tab, and just hit this divide. It's going to add extra subdivisions. You can see the number of points, again, is increasing. What am I saying? and it'll allow you to go back in and add a little bit more detail and refine your sculpting. And this works sometimes and not others, it breaks down a little bit if you have tries in your mesh, which is annoying. But this reconstruct subdiv button, yeah. If your mesh contains triangles, it'll cancel it. But a lot of times what this will let you do is go through and actually basically unsubdivide your model. Where, say if we started out at this level 2 with like more polygons, this reconstruct subdivision button will basically add an additional lower level of polygons. When it works, it's great. When it doesn't, it's kind of a bummer. The other option that you have is you can always try doing a Z-remesher with fewer target polys, and that is just sort of like really, really quick and dirty way to like try to get fewer polygons. It doesn't always work ideally, but if you're trying to sculpt like a really high poly tree, that's kind of like what you get. So, any questions on any of that? It was kind of like a weird sort of vague demo, but questions on that? All right. So again, this is what I would do if you're trying to make like a really weird foreground tree or something like that, your character's standing in a tree, it might not be a terrible idea to go back in and do this. If you're just looking for some background trees, you're probably good leaving the poly paint trees more or less as they are. There are two other things that I want to show you really, really quickly in ZBrush, and that is mostly actually adding custom alphas. So I mentioned last week that you can import pretty much whatever weird images that you want into your alpha, usually like a black and white image. So in this case, I literally just Googled Bark Alpha ZBrush, and it pops up this. This is something that you could then import into ZBrush and make like really nice custom bark textures. So I'll just save that as bark, and I'll do another one of just like squiggle. Ooh, chain link, that's exciting. That is actually sadly exciting to me. All right, so save those, and again, textures.com has a lot of these, particularly for rocks. You can make your own if you're so inclined. They all pretty much import the same way. So to actually make these work, again, so usually I'll do this on the standard brush. Just click on your little alpha box here, and you have the option to use pretty much any of these default presets. These are like these weird little sort of squiggly things. Draw those in. If you want to import the ones you just downloaded or made, just go down into this little import tab and find whatever image files you were looking for. So I'll start with the bark. And then you should be good to just draw them pretty much straight onto your mesh. That's giant. And just sort of plop those in. So it can be a really, really powerful way to go through and again, get like a pretty decent looking tree texture without having to do some crazy thing where you like manually hand sculpt in a bunch of bark or something on this tree. There are definitely better bark textures than this one, but you know, that's pretty much the basic process of like importing your own alphas. Same thing with the chain link, you know, if you want a chainmail tree, it is a thing. All of your dreams can now come true. But yeah, so at this point you would either, having UV'd this, you could go through and export a texture map for this, either, you know, a normal map or a displacement map, ouch. If you wanted a high poly version of this tree for some reason, honestly, overkill unless you're 3D printing this where you need the model super high poly, but you just go into the Z plugin, Decimation Master, and then just pre-process that like we did last week. In this case, I don't think that's necessary for any of this. What you can do, if you're so inclined, is, like if you're happy with the overall shape of this tree, but you're like, this is way too many, I don't need a 20,000 polygon tree. This is something you could do for a game asset where you go into the Decimation Master and sort of pre-process this, and go in and then just strip the crap out of these polys. Like take it down to 6% polys. This is still, you know, 1,000 polygon tree, which is still crazy. So take it down to maybe like 1%. That was excessive. But again, the beauty of Z-Remesher is that, or Decimation Master, is it allows you to make these changes really quickly and find a level of, you know, poly count versus quality that you're happy with. So in this case, we have this lovely like 456 polygon tree. That looks pretty decent. Like that's a pretty not bad looking tree. It did strip a lot of those little mini branches away, but I hate those, so that's fine. And again, this is triangulated for games, doesn't matter. I'm just gonna say I'm happy with this tree. So this is like sort of, it also does a cool thing where it like kind of looks neat and low poly. Like I like the faceting pattern on that. But I'm just gonna go ahead and export this and show you the comparison, I guess. It's gonna be a weird comparison. But the comparison between this and the original tree we started with. While I'm figuring out where I save things, anyone have any questions on any of that? All right. Cool. So this tree is probably going to look nothing like this one at all, which is kind of sad. I really do like that curly cherry tree. Like that was pretty neat. Oh my god. Okay. Okay. Yes. This is apparently what a incredibly low poly cherry tree looks like. Also beware, it does, I just noticed this in Maya, but it looks like ZBrush has left lots of itty bitty specks of geometry just floating around. Sometimes Decimation Master will do that. The upside, it's gonna cut a few more polys out when we do a mesh separate. Oh yes, delightful. Look at all of these pieces. Should be good to just select the main tree and then just delete everything else from here, and then you should have a tree without extra crap all over it. But that's basically a weird bit on trees. Questions before I move on to how to attach these to a landscape? All right, cool. I'm just gonna start a new scene because this one is cluttered and gross and makes me sad. So to put trees on a landscape, you need trees and you need a landscape. First thing, dang it. Alternate quick way to get rid of these extra little faces floating around. Double click on the main tree. It'll select that and not anything else. And then you can just go really wide and shift marquee select over everything. It'll invert your selection basically and select all of the little dots instead. So we should be good to delete those. Holy crap, that was like 80 polys that just stripped out. So we have the tree. I'm just gonna go ahead and shift the, I'm just moving the faces of this tree over so it's kind of on the origin, sort of. Sometimes Mash gets a little bit weird if your object is like floating really crazy off in space. So when in doubt, put your object on the origin, make a delightful ground plane that is not rotated to oblivion. And I'm just gonna throw in a few more subdivisions onto this. 30, what the heck. And add some interesting terrain features, namely sad smooth hills. Yay, sad smooth hills. Let's get really weird. Let's get really weird with our hills. All right, we have this ground and the ocean from Moana. We want this tree basically all over this ground, and Mash allows you a really easy way to do that. It's basically like procedural populating of objects. So to get started with Mash, just go into this, there's this little Mash tab sort of right here. Click on that and select whatever object you want to be duplicated and do this Create Mash Network button, very leftmost button under that little shelf. Click on that. By default, it's going to go through, and I'm just gonna really quick make these brown or something so you can actually see the difference between the ground and trees. Great. By default, Mash is just going to copy your object 10 times and put them in a line. And honestly, when you do this, this looks surprisingly ordered, like you intended these to be knit or something. But in this case, it looks ridiculous unless you're trying to make some weird orchard or something. So you want to modify the way this looks because it looks pretty crazy. Before we do that, when you make a mesh, so this little like repro mesh is just basically like the mesh that Mash is generating for you. It does leave, if you want to find it, your original tree in the scene. And the cool thing about Mash is that all of these trees are instanced based off the original one. So if you make a change to this one, say extrude a base out of it, it's going to do that to all your other trees. So it's a really, really easy way to make sweeping changes to things. You can also go through, like if you rotate the faces on your base tree, it'll rotate all of these guys. So it's pretty powerful in that way, where it's like you haven't locked yourself in once you create this mesh network. So I'm just going to hide that original tree and open up the mesh editor, which is this little button right next to the create mesh network. It's kind of like the outliner for mesh. It basically just shows you all the different meshes that you have in your scene. And anytime you make one, a new mesh network, it by default creates a distribute node. This is just saying like, hey, how do you want these trees positioned? So if we click on this and go into our attribute editor, you notice a bunch of different settings. So like number of points or trees. You can, set them to be radial if you want a glorious wheel of trees. I don't know why you'd want that. But there's a bunch of different other sort of random options. There's like grid, etc. Mostly I use mesh. I find that to just sort of be the most useful for me. And by default, that's not going to do anything. You need to attach a mesh into that. So if you click on your distribute again, and then just middle mouse button click your ground plane or whatever mesh you want to attach into this input mesh, and it should then scatter your trees haphazardly on the ground. Anyone notice anything weird about these trees by chance? Mostly like this guy here, just chilling. So there's a few options that you can do once you set this up. One, I'm just going to add a few more trees onto here. So you can do as many trees as you want. There's different methods for attaching these to the mesh. So scatter is just randomly across the surface. Vertex is going to line up your trees in a very ordered fashion, one tree per vertex basically. So this can be a useful way to populate things actually. Face center is kind of the same thing, just with face centers. You could do random face center, and this is gonna, it's kind of like the equivalent of scatter, but if you needed everything to be laid out in like a grid, you could do that. It's going to behave a little bit more like a game of Battleship or something than like, I'm going to throw marbles on the floor. In this case, scatter makes sense. I'm just going to leave it at scatter. So like I said, right now we have trees growing horizontally out of this awkward mountain that I've added in. If you don't want that to be a thing, take this calculate rotation and just turn it off. All your trees will be pointing delightfully up into the air like they should be doing. I was going to say like they should be doing. If you're ever driving down 76 towards from like driving south on 76 into the city, if you look at the old like industrial train tracks, there is a tree that is legitimately growing out of the side of a train track, pretty much like this. One tree.
That's my favorite tree.
Yes, it's so good. I pointed out to all the Lyft drivers that I take every once in a while, and they're like, oh my god, that's so weird. But yeah, literally, it's just sticking out of the train tracks, and it's insane. If you're not recreating that tree, turn off this button. So this pretty much is then what you have. Anyone have any questions so far? All right. So there's a few other sort of random settings. I'll get to those. I have like another weird little like sub-nebo, like bonus with MASH. But right now, looks pretty good position-wise. It's a little bit strange that if you look at these trees, it's pretty obvious they're all facing the same direction, right? Like they all have the exact same rotation, which is a little bit weird. If you want to correct that, you would just want to add basically another node to your MASH network. So if you click on in your MASH editor, just click on the MASH 1, and it's going to pull up all of these different sort of extra nodes that you can add in to your network. There's a lot of crazy stuff you can do with this. You can use MASH to control animations, so you can have like a flapping flock of birds where all the birds are sort of flapping at different times. I'm just going to go over the one node, which is the random node. So if you click on that and just do add random, it should, you might need to refresh your MASH editor, but it should pop up this random node here. And by default, when you do a random node, it is going to make some of your trees float, which is not ideal. This is basically how much randomness or change do you want in a particular axis. So you can control the translation, rotation, and scale. By default, it's like, hey, let's move these all randomly between 0 and 1 units. And we don't really want them moved, especially on the translate Y. Because, like, why? Ha ha ha. Nobody, okay. In this case, what we want to do is just turn that off, because again, we don't really want floating trees. We only really want these to be rotated, not on the X, clearly, on the Y axis. And you'll notice, like, as I scrub through this, it's sort of changing all of the rotation of these trees. So this is entirely dependent on where the object's pivot is. If the pivot is, not centered in your object, this might end up spinning way more crazily, but if we go back down and we sort of look in here, it feels a lot more varied in terms of like a nice grove of trees than it did previously. The other thing you can do is mess with the random seed. And I am awful at describing what seed is. If you're familiar with coding and random number generators, it's pretty much the same thing. Basically, this is just sort of the number that it uses in its calculation formula of randomness. So inputting a different number should give you slightly different results. So you can play with this if you were so inclined. You could also play with the strength of the randomness. So 0 is basically no randomness, 1 is full random, and then random strength. This one's a little bit harder to see in my opinion, so I'll leave that set to 1. If you look at strength, it looks kind of like all the trees are more or less like moving the same amount, if that kind of makes sense, whereas with the strength, it's, I don't know how to describe it. They seem to like move or change differently. Honestly, if you're not like sliding these actively, I don't notice a huge difference between the two. But that's pretty much changing the rotation. The other thing you can do with this random node is mess with the scale. And there is 2 ways to do that. The first is if you don't care if your tree stretches really aggressively sideways. So if we are only changing the scale of the X, it does some pretty strange stuff to the trees. This one's pretty normal and the rest of them are not. There's a button if you care about the proportions of your object to correct that, and that is this uniform scale button. So if you click this, it should take all of these rotations. So if it's scaling it at all, it's going to scale it uniformly across all of the axes so that you don't have insane stretched flat trees like this. So again, if you care about your scale, you can do that. The other, for something like a tree, I find that usually just don't set the settings that aggressive and just sort of play with all of them, and it kind of like evens out, sort of, except kind of for that tree. But that can also be an interesting way to like add some variation into this weird mesh forest that we've created. And that is usually, honestly, how I go about populating trees in a scene. If you decide that you don't want trees on a specific part of your ground, you can go through and just sort of delete sections of your ground, and it will change the distribution of your mesh network that way. So if you have like something like a walking path or something going through the ground, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll basically just make a copy of the ground, delete any areas that I know I don't want trees, reduce the mesh a little bit because it doesn't need to be super high poly, and just use that to generate the mesh on from the start. The other really nice thing about mesh, you notice when I deleted a giant chunk of the floor, it sort of changed the mesh network, but if I, go through with soft select, it's going to change the position of the trees pretty much no matter what I do to this mesh. So if you decide, oh, I need some extra hills in the background, something like that, it's really easy to go back in and apply those later. And it's also really easy to use the same settings if you decide, I've resculpted a piece of my ground or something like that in ZBrush, like let me import a new ground plane and do things that way. So imagine that this lovely sphere is my new ground plane. If you just grab that P sphere 1 and middle mouse button, drag it into the input mesh on your distribute node, it's going to transfer all my trees to the ground here. In this case, perhaps the setting of calculate rotation being turned off is not ideal. If you turn this on again, then you should get this nice sort of weird world covered in tiny trees. But that's, again, probably all you would need to know to populate mesh into, for like landscape stuff. You could do the same thing with grass. If you had you know, maybe 1 or 2 different varieties of trees, which is kind of nice, I think, if you're doing stuff. So I'm just going to say, hey, this cone is my tree. I'm feeling very low effort. You can generate another mesh for this. So just, again, Mash tab, and go through the same steps as before. So grab the distribute, just make sure that it is set to mesh, and in this case, I'm going to grab my P sphere again and attach the cones onto that. So they are showing up, there's just not a whole lot of them. And you'll see that actually, interestingly, that's actually really interesting. They're showing up mostly on the same spots as the trees, which is kind of strange. So this is one of those instances where you're like, ooh, my trees are showing up in the same spot. You can go through in the strength node and just like change the seed, and now they're showing up in very different spots. But that's how you could populate, you know, multiple things, like different trees, or like you wanted some pebbles or something like that. I really, really like Mash for this stuff. Any questions on that? Okay. I do want to show you one other really strange side demo for Mash. I use this to populate a bunch of, like 1,000 scales on a snake in 20 minutes. It was amazing. It was so easy. So I'll just walk you through really quick, like that whole thing. There's a sort of like silly, fake, clever thing that you can do with, all right, so there's a weird sort of polygon thing that you can do that allows this to be sort of really, really easy. So the same process, I think it's more interesting on a snake, which is why I'm showing you the snake. But the same process is going to work for something like shingling a roof, or doing stadium seating, or like pretty much anything where you need lots of different, what am I saying? Where you need lots of different sort of things uniformly laid out, but like staggered. So I'm gonna, as I sort of set up this weird thing in the background, I'm just gonna rebuild this curve really quick. Feel free, if you guys have questions about what I'm doing, let me know. I'm just sort of setting up weird back-end stuff. God, 41 is probably excessive, whatever. All right, cool, this is gonna be our snake for now. So we have this incredibly awkward snake thing. I'm just gonna kind of delete this part here. So let's assume that we want this to, oh, this is, nah, I can't do it. Sorry, that was just like actually so appalling looking that I just don't even want to use that. All right, so we have our mesh. I'm just gonna add some crappy hills and valleys like I did before, and we're just gonna kind of run with that. So this is what we got. And there is one thing that I want to show you really, really quickly that we need to do to this. So basically, if we make, again, I'm so brainwashed with interactive creation turned off that I like can't, or turned on that I can't function if it's not there. It's terrible. So here is the worst scale that has ever been generated in the history of humanity. I'm just going to call this scale. Hooray. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw this on my planes. I'm going to, again, assign this a different material just so you can see what's actually happening here. So same thing before, mash, generate, or create a mesh network. It's going to do this weird distribute thing with like 10 lines. And I'm just going to go into that and attach these goofy scales to my goofy mesh. Oops. Attach. So you can see it's gone through and it's populated all of the scales. I grabbed the wrong mesh, that's fine. It's populated all the scales over here. So there's 2 settings that you can kind of do to tweak this. And that is, like, I basically want these scales to be laid out along these vertices or these faces. So I'm going to go ahead and just do face center for my mode, and you can see that it's gone through and sort of populated that on each face center. Instead of having to guess the exact number of face center, or like number of points on this, there's a really, really easy button if you ever just need to fill a mesh with objects, and that is flood mesh down here, right under calculate rotation. This only works for something like face center or vertices where there's like a specific set number of points. But if I click that, it's going to automatically fill my entire mesh with these goofy scales. The other thing that you can do that's pretty powerful is if you go under, where is it, face edge settings, still in the distribute node, if you turn on enable scaling, it's going to try to basically automatically fill that square or that plane with your object. So it can make things a little bit easier, just trying to figure out like what, size everything is. In the case of my snake, I had some vertices like in the side, which were much, much smaller, like little faces in the side. So it's going to automatically try to scale the scales in accordance with the size of your mesh. So it can be a really convenient way to sort of deal with that if you need to. Happened to work great on the snake. But if we're looking at this, apart from just being generally ugly as scales, they're not really laid out in a realistic way, where like they make sense sort of going next to each other like this, but if you have actual scales, they're usually staggered, where like the point of this scale should be between these guys here. And this is where the weird geometry hack comes into play. So this is like totally great for populating seats and stuff like that. If you need that staggered look for something like a roof or scales, this is what you'd want to do. Select all of your edges on your object. And this part is like weird but important. Select all the edges on the object, do create, sets, and quick select set. Basically what this is you saving a mini preset of something that you want to select frequently or again. So if you spent a bunch of time selecting a specific array of faces or something like that, you can make a little quick select set for it. If I click outside of that, go back in, I'll select some new random faces, whatever. When I go back in and I want to reselect all of them like previously, I'll just go to select menu, quick select sets, and any that you make should show up here. So I'll just grab this little edges one I made, and you notice it automatically selects all of the edges on this. Really important considering what we're about to do to this mesh, and that is we're going to poke the mesh. The tool is literally called poke. Select your mesh, go to edit mesh, and towards the bottom, the promised option of poke. I pretty much never play with these settings. I actually don't even know what the tool settings look like. Okay, cool. Go ahead and apply that, and it's gone through and pretty much added weird cross-hatching to your mesh. Every once in a while, this is useful. It's great for populating stuff like mesh. Not bad for making strawberries. Potentially interesting if you do something like turn off keep faces together and like extrude these and smooth it. You get this weird sort of pattern if you needed that. It's a very strange tool that occasionally is very useful. In this case, we don't want any of these sort of edge loops that we had previously. So we're going to go through, select, grab our quick select set and our edges, and should be good to just go through and delete those. And it's only grabbed some of them. Why was that a thing? Okay. Now let's grab the rest of them, and they're gone now. Hooray. Okay. So this probably seems like really weird and inconsequential. Most times it is. Functionally, this looks like exactly the same square as it used to. You'll just sort of notice, like, again, the shape is pretty much the same, except for this little thing I did. But instead of having this lovely perfect grid going up and down and left to right, we have this strange diagonal grid on our piece. And this is what's going to give us the nice staggering of the scales. Or your stadium seats, or your shingles, or like whatever you're trying to populate with the shape. So what I'm going to do is just set up, I will grab the corner of this and do the sort of scaling again, just so it kind of looks similar. So I'll go into my distribute and grab P-plane 2, I think it was, and throw that in. And you can see that now the little scales kind of tile a lot nicer with each other. The scale of the scales is still pretty off, but they're at least in the correct position. So does that make sense what I've done so far? Cool. This is like my weird favorite demo where it's just like every once in a while it's incredibly useful. So I'm going to unhide that scale, and if I wanted to, change the size of these at this point, I'd probably just physically just scale up the original scale. That'll scale up all of these guys. And the other thing you can do is go through and rotate sort of the faces. That'll kind of make a little bit more of like a staggered effect with these guys. Obviously, you could do a little bit better shaping on these to make sure that they're not clipping. But now we have something that kind of resembles, you know, fish scales or something strange like that. There is one other weird thing which is like very niche good to know about MASH, and that is so if you look at this original scale, it is pointing basically downwards in our scene. If you look at all of these, they're pointing to the left. I did not realize this until the other day when I was doing my snake. But if you're ever doing this and parts of your, like some of the mesh has scales pointed towards the left and the other have scales pointed towards the right, it's dependent on the UVs, which is really weird. And it was very strange. So if you turn off calculate rotation, you'll notice that all the scales point the correct direction. But in this case, I kind of like calculate rotation because it has these all nicely like curved around the surface. So I do want that, and I want to keep that. In this case, if I wanted to change the direction of the UVs, I could either cheat and just sort of rotate the faces on this original object, or, again, go into your UV editor and literally just grab the UV shell and just rotate the UV shell. You'll notice this is changing the direction of the scales. I don't know why this is a thing or how it decides which way the scale should be facing, but it can also potentially be a good way to make, part of the thing rotate different directions if you wanted to. So if you did want that sort of like, I'm actually thinking, those awful pillows covered in sequins that you can kind of like shift around? If you wanted to make that effect, you could conceivably do it with the UVs. Just a weird note about how MASH calculates that rotation. I almost never find it useful, but like every once in a while it is. That is basically my weird MASH thing for the day. Anybody have any questions about that, or I think pretty much anything else I've done? Cool. Yes?
Can you apply animation to MASH?
Yes. Honestly, off the top of my head, I don't remember how to do it.
I'll just ask on it.
I know I did like a little thing about it once. There is some stuff that you can do with like an orientation node. I think.
Like created a shape, animated, and then assigned it to a human model, and then caused the human model to animate with the MASH animating on top of it.
Yeah. Yeah, off the top of my head, I have no idea. I mostly, background tidbit on me, I mostly do 3D modeling for 3D printing, so like most of the random knowledge I accumulate is modeling based, unless I'm like specifically trying to do a demo on something. YouTube also has a lot of great tutorials about like how to animate stuff with MASH. Like I said, if you are trying to do something like a flock of birds and you make one flapping bird animation, you can use MASH to sort of like offset that so all the birds aren't like flapping in unison. But yeah, cool. Any other questions on stuff? All right, 2 seconds. Let me just make sure that I went over everything. All right, there is one more weird tidbit that I wanted to mention, and it's less of a tutorial and more like a really dumb workaround for Maya. If you had issues importing video reference into your scene, I spent like 5 hours of time researching that on the weekend, and there is literally only one solution I can come up with. So one weird note, apparently on Windows, Maya will only import AVIs, and sometimes if it's just like in the wrong codec, it's just like, nah. So if you can't get any of your videos to import, what you can do, first of all, try getting it into an AVI, if you can. If that still doesn't work, go into After Effects and Premiere and save out your entire stinking clip as an image sequence, and that you should be able to import into Maya. So here's my random notes that I leave up in the background. There's a bunch of tutorials about sort of how to generate that image sequence. The thing that I want to sort of touch on is Maya is absurdly picky about naming of those files. So if you have to go the image generation route, make sure that there are no spaces in your file name, and make sure that if you have frame padding, there is no more than 4 digits of frame padding. So, as an example, 0001 is fine. 00001 will not work. Maya's really dumb. You can correct this if you want to go into your preferences folder and like update stuff. Yeah.
It also needs to be 24 frames per second.
Also, for an image sequence?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting. I've never found that as a setting, but yeah, usually Maya's also weird about frame rates and stuff matching up as well. That is a fair point, thank you. So like pretty much, again, 4 digits of frame padding or less. So like 001 is fine, 1 is fine. Just anything where your number is 5 digits or longer, Maya's gonna throw a hissy fit at you. I don't know why that's a thing. Again, don't put spaces in your stuff. That will break pretty much everything. You should be good to do, like if you want to separate, in terms of actually like naming the file, so you do like file.01 should be fine, file01 should be fine. File parentheses, any number is, usually the parentheses aren't recognized, so I would just sort of stick to one of these two sort of ways of separating the number from the file name itself. Once you've done that, you should be good to go ahead and just do like view, import image plane. Just do import image like you normally would for a reference. Grab your files from chainlink files, great. And once that's in, you should be able to just check this little use image sequence button right below where you import or like pick the file path. And it should go through, if your files are named in the format that Maya likes, whenever you scrub through your frames, it should basically substitute, frame 1 for this like frame 11. And that's sadly the best workaround I could find for images or like video reference not working in Maya. I just wanted to sort of bring that up because I know 1 or 2 people had issues with that, and I did spend like way too long just like trying to figure out how to do that. Are there any questions on that? If anyone like magically found other solutions to like somehow make their videos and stuff work, please do let me know. That is something I would love to share with people, because that is really convoluted, and you end up with like several gigabytes of files, which sucks. But yeah, that was pretty much all I had for you guys. Any questions on any random stuff? Was that cool? Yeah, I was actually going to break into Open Lab. So this Open Lab is not mandatory. So if you want to run away, feel free to run away.